There are stories in the Bible that resemble quiet rivers. They do not rush like torrents, nor roar like waterfalls, but they carry in their depths the hidden power to transform whole landscapes. The story of Esther is one of those rivers. She was not introduced with thunder or fire from heaven. She did not stand on mountaintops proclaiming oracles to multitudes. She entered quietly, like a whisper. A young woman, an orphan, exiled in a foreign land. Hardly anyone would imagine that her destiny would one day intertwine with the fate of her entire people. And perhaps this is exactly how God delights to work. He chooses the overlooked, the silent, the fragile, and through them he accomplishes what shakes empires and rewrites history. Esther grew up without her father or mother, raised by her cousin Mordecai. In those hidden years, she learned humility, the wisdom of listening, and the discipline of holding on to faith even when the world seemed against her. She belonged to a nation living in exile, scattered and vulnerable under the shadow of Persia's might. In the world's eyes, she had little worth, just another displaced young woman with no heritage to claim, no family name to lift her high. But in God's eyes, emptiness is never useless. An empty vessel has the most room to be filled. A vacant soil is ready for the seed. And so Esther's nothingness became the canvas upon which God would paint a deliverance remembered for generations. The story turns when King Ahasuerus, known in history as Xerxes, held a grand banquet lasting many months. He displayed his wealth, his glory, his dominance. But in one dramatic moment, his pride collided with resistance. Drunk with power and wine, the king summoned Queen Vashti to parade her beauty before his nobles. Yet Vashti refused. A bold act, but one that cost her the crown. Instantly, the palace shook with scandal, and counselors advised the king to depose her, lest women throughout the empire rise in similar defiance. So Vashti was dethroned, and the empire, restless for spectacle, prepared to find a new queen. A search began. The most beautiful young women from all the provinces were gathered into the palace harem. Among them was Esther. She did not enter with loud ambition, nor with demands for attention. She entered with quiet grace. She listened to the advice of Haggai, the eunuch in charge of the women, and did not grasp for more than what was given. Her humility, her willingness to yield, her gentle spirit, these distinguished her. She found favor with everyone who saw her. When at last she was brought before the king, her beauty was undeniable, but it was the radiance of her character that captured his heart. And so the orphan girl was crowned queen, with a golden crown resting where once there had only been ashes of loss. It would be easy to stop here, to tie a neat ribbon around the tale. The rags to riches story of a girl elevated from obscurity to royalty. But God's purposes are never limited to personal comfort. His blessings are never only about the individual. The crown on Esther's head was not simply for her. It was for a nation. It was for a mission hidden in time. In the shadows, another figure emerges. Haman, the king's high official. Arrogant and consumed by pride, he demanded that all bow before him. Most complied. But Mordecai, Esther's cousin, refused. His knees bent only to God. His defiance enraged Haman. And pride, once wounded, often festers into hatred. It was not enough for Haman to punish Mordecai alone. He plotted the annihilation of the entire Jewish people throughout the empire. With cunning words, he convinced the king to issue a decree of destruction. Sealed with the royal signet, the edict spread across the provinces like a death sentence carried on the wind. Imagine the terror. Families trembling, children crying, mothers holding their sons and daughters with the knowledge that a date had been fixed for their extermination. In city squares and dusty streets, news of the decree spread, and the sound of mourning rose like smoke. Mordecai himself tore his clothes, clothed himself in sackcloth and ashes, and sat outside the king's gate in grief. The news reached Esther inside the palace. Safe behind golden walls, she felt the weight of dread. Yet she also felt the sharp edge of helplessness. What could she, a single woman, even a queen, do against such a decree? The law of Persia was merciless. Anyone who approached the king uninvited risked death, unless the king extended his golden scepter. Esther had not been summoned for 30 days. The silence of the king loomed like a shadow. Fear tightened around her heart. It was then that Mordecai's message came to her, a message that cracked her fear wide open. Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? These words landed like thunder. They were not mere persuasion. They were revelation. Esther suddenly saw her crown in a new light. She had not been lifted to royalty for herself, but for this very crisis. The palace was not her refuge. It was her responsibility. Her comfort was not her calling. Her courage was and so she replied with trembling resolve. Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. This is courage, not the absence of fear, but the choice to act in spite of it. Courage is not a heart of steel that feels nothing. It is a heart of flesh that quivers but still moves forward. Esther's fear did not vanish. It became an offering, laid upon the altar of obedience. Perhaps you have stood in similar places. A decision looms, one that could cost you dearly, your comfort, your reputation, even relationships you hold dear. You hear the whisper, you cannot do this. You are too small, too weak, too fragile, and perhaps you tremble. But throughout Scripture, it is often the trembling ones that God chooses. Moses, with his stammering tongue, sent to confront Pharaoh. Gideon, hiding in fear, called to lead Israel's army. Mary, a teenage girl in Nazareth, chosen to carry the Savior of the world. God delights in vessels that know their weakness, because through them his strength shines brightest. Esther, too, trembled, yet she chose to step. For 3 days she fasted, prayed, and waited. She stripped away the perfumes, the oils, the cosmetics that once adorned her for the king. Now she adorned herself with something different, dependence. She clothed herself not only in royal garments but in unseen armor, faith, humility, surrender. And on the 3rd day, she walked through the corridors of the palace toward the throne room, where her life could end in an instant. Picture her steps echoing through the marble halls. Each one might have felt heavier than the last. Servants may have whispered. Guards may have watched with curiosity. But she pressed forward. The door to the throne room opened, and light from golden pillars filled her eyes. The king sat upon his throne, flanked by power and splendor. And there, alone, Esther stood, waiting to see whether the golden scepter would rise or whether silence would seal her fate. This is where the first act of her story closes. in the tension between fear and faith, silence and speech, death and deliverance. She is no longer simply an orphan girl. She is no longer merely a queen. She has become an intercessor, standing between her people and destruction. And in her trembling courage, we glimpse a truth that sometimes the smallest acts of faith, taken in weakness, can shift the destinies of nations. The silence in the throne room must have felt like an eternity. Every heartbeat pounded in Esther's chest as though the echo might give her away. Before her sat the king, cloaked in royal majesty, attended by guards and servants who waited for the slightest gesture. The law was clear. To approach the throne without being summoned was to gamble with one's life. Esther's destiny balanced on the angle of a golden scepter. And then it moved. The king extended the scepter toward her. The breath that she had been holding escaped in a silent prayer of relief. Life had been spared. The door of possibility had been opened. Esther stepped forward, touched the tip of the scepter, and bowed. The king's words were surprisingly warm. "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given you, even to half of my kingdom." At that moment, many of us might have blurted out the whole matter, the threat of Haman, the impending destruction of her people. But Esther was wise, and her wisdom was more than cleverness. It was spirit-led discernment. She did not rush. She did not scatter her words in panic. Instead, she invited the king and Haman to a banquet she had prepared. She chose patience, knowing that timing can be as important as truth. The first banquet was lavish, prepared with the care of a queen whose life was hidden in her God. The king, once more, asked Esther for her request. Again she delayed. She invited him and Haman to yet another banquet on the following day. To some, this might appear as hesitation, but beneath it was divine strategy. Esther was not only speaking, she was creating space for God to work. Meanwhile, outside the palace, Haman was swelling with pride. Few men could boast of dining privately with the king and queen. He left the banquet with a chest full of arrogance until his eyes fell on Mordecai, who once again refused to bow. Rage consumed him. Pride wounded is often more dangerous than pride satisfied. That night, Haman's family and friends encouraged him to build a gallows, 75 feet high, upon which to hang Mordecai. With his heart intoxicated by hatred, Haman ordered it built. But God, unseen and unnamed in this book, was weaving a story through the most ordinary threads. That same night, the king could not sleep. Was it coincidence? Or was it the whisper of providence? He called for the book of the Chronicles to be read aloud to him. And there, in the turning of dusty pages, he discovered the record of Mordecai's act of loyalty years earlier, how Mordecai had uncovered a plot to assassinate the king. Strangely, no reward had been given. The timing was divine. At dawn, Haman entered the palace, ready to request Mordecai's execution. But before he could speak, the king asked him a question. What should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? Haman's pride blinded him. Who else could the king wish to honor but him? His imagination soared. He suggested royal robes, a crown, a horse from the king's own stable, and a public parade led by one of the highest officials. The king agreed and commanded Haman himself to honor Mordecai in this very way. Imagine the humiliation. The man who planned Mordecai's death now led him through the streets proclaiming, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." God was already turning the story upside down. By the time Haman returned home, humiliated, His wife and friends warned him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him but surely fall before him." But Haman had no time to brood, for the king's eunuchs arrived to hurry him to Esther's second banquet. There, the drama reached its height. The king, once more, asked Esther what her request was. And at last, Esther spoke the truth. "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated." The king, startled, asked who could dare do such a thing. Esther's finger pointed, and her voice named the adversary. "A foe and enemy. This wicked Haman." The banquet hall filled with shock. Haman's face drained of color. The king, enraged, stormed out into the garden. In desperation, Haman fell before Esther, pleading for his life. Yet when the king returned and saw Haman falling on the couch where Esther reclined, his anger burned hotter. Will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house? Guards seized Haman, and one of the eunuchs pointed out the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. The king gave the order. That very day, Haman was hanged on the gallows he had built. It would be comforting if the story ended there, but the decree of death still hung over the Jews. In Persian law, no edict sealed with the king's signet could be revoked. Though Haman was dead, his decree lived on. The sword of destruction still threatened every Jewish household across the empire. Esther once again approached the king, this time weeping and begging him to reverse the disaster plotted against her people. The king extended his scepter again, granting her audience. He could not erase the law, but he authorized a new decree. Mordecai, now elevated to Haman's former position, drafted it. The Jews in every city were granted the right to assemble and defend their lives, to destroy anyone who attacked them, to seize their goods if necessary. Letters were dispatched swiftly on royal horses, spreading hope where once there had been despair. The Jews rejoiced. Mourning turned into celebration, fasting into feasting. Across provinces, the tables turned. When the appointed day of destruction came, the Jews rose to defend themselves, and fear of them fell upon their enemies. The officials of the provinces even supported them, for Mordecai's fame had spread. What was intended for their annihilation became their deliverance. This reversal became the origin of the Feast of Purim, a day of joy and remembrance, when sorrow was turned into gladness, and mourning into a holiday. To this day, Jewish communities around the world celebrate it as a testament to God's hidden hand, never named in the book of Esther, yet undeniably present in every twist and turn. But let us pause here and reflect. What do we learn from Esther's unfolding story? We see that courage often requires patience. When the moment first came to speak, she chose to wait, to invite the king to banquets, to trust in timing rather than force the issue. Courage is not reckless haste. It is discerning when to move, when to wait, and when to act with boldness. We also see that pride, like Haman's, blinds and destroys. His lust for honor led him to disgrace. His hatred of one man drove him to plot the death of thousands, and yet it was that hatred which became the trap for his own downfall. And above all, we see that God is at work even when his name is not mentioned. The sleepless night of the king, the turning of the chronicles, the timing of banquets, the extension of the scepter, all these appear like chance, but in truth they are threads in a divine tapestry. Perhaps your own life feels like silence, like absence. Perhaps you cannot see God's hand in the ordinary rhythm of days. The story of Esther whispers to you, do not mistake silence for absence. God is still weaving. He is still working. In your own struggles, you may feel the weight of decrees written against you, decrees of shame, of fear, of failure. Yet the cross of Christ has issued a greater decree, one of grace, forgiveness, and freedom. Just as the Jews received the right to stand and defend themselves, so too we have been given authority in Christ to stand against the powers of darkness, clothed not with our own strength but with his victory. Esther's courage is not only a historical event, it is a living invitation. It calls us to rise, to trust that our lives have purpose beyond our comfort, to step into roles that may frighten us, but for which we have been placed for such a time as this. The days after the victory were not simply days of relief, they were days of transformation. The Jews, once trembling under the shadow of annihilation, now stood with dignity and strength. Their enemies had been disarmed, their voices lifted in praise. What had been meant for their destruction had become their deliverance. Yet the story of Esther does not end with survival alone. It carries within it lessons that echo through centuries, calling us to consider what true deliverance means and how courage continues long after the battle is won. Mordecai, who had once sat in sackcloth outside the king's gate, was now clothed in royal garments of blue and white, with a great golden crown and a robe of fine linen and purple. From ashes to honor, his journey mirrored the story of his people. Mourning turned into joy, despair into hope. His elevation was not a private triumph, but a public testimony that the God of Israel defends his people even when his hand is unseen. The city of Susa shouted and rejoiced, and for the Jews there was light, gladness, joy, and honor. But Esther and Mordecai did not allow the memory of their deliverance to fade into the mists of time. They established a new festival, Purim. Letters were sent to Jews throughout the empire, instructing them to remember these days each year, to feast, to rejoice, to send food to one another and gifts to the poor. Why? Because memory is powerful. Deliverance forgotten can breed complacency, but deliverance remembered renews faith. Every year when the story was retold, children who had not lived through the terror would learn, our God is faithful. Our God preserves his people. Consider the weight of this. Esther could have been content to remain silent after her victory, enjoying her royal status, letting future generations fend for themselves. But she and Mordecai saw further. They knew that memory is what carries faith through generations. That is why Scripture is full of commands to remember. Remember the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. Remember the covenant. Remember his mighty works. Memory is not nostalgia. It is fuel for faith. For us, the story of Purim reminds us that our testimonies are not meant to be buried. When God delivers us from fear, from bondage, from sin, we are called to remember, to celebrate, and to tell the story. Too often we forget the moments when God carried us through. The joy fades, and we slip back into worry as though he had never acted. But when we recall his faithfulness, when we mark the milestones of grace, we strengthen our faith for the challenges still to come. Esther's courage also teaches us that deliverance is not the end of responsibility. True courage is not a single act of bravery. It is a posture of life. To step into the role God has given us for such a time as this is not only about one decisive moment, but about the ongoing faithfulness that follows. Esther did not vanish after her bold approach to the king. She continued to intercede, to act, to ensure her people's safety. Likewise, we are not called to a single act of faith, but to a lifetime of it. Let us pause and reflect. Where might God be calling you to step into courage beyond a single moment? Perhaps you have already faced a great challenge and seen His hand deliver you. But now the question remains, how will you live in remembrance? How will you use your story to encourage others? How will you continue to stand with courage in daily obedience, not just in crisis? Another theme that rises from Esther's story is the great reversal. Over and over again, what was meant for evil turned into good. Haman built gallows for Mordecai, yet he was the one hanged upon them. Haman plotted destruction for the Jews, yet they were granted authority to defend themselves and overcame their enemies. Mourning turned into feasting. Darkness turned into light. This is not just poetic irony. It is the heartbeat of redemption. It foreshadows the cross of Christ, where the greatest evil ever committed, the crucifixion of the Son of God, became the very means by which salvation came to the world. Satan thought he had won when Christ hung on the tree. But just as Haman's gallows became his own undoing, so the cross became the undoing of death itself. What the enemy intended for destruction, God transformed into deliverance. This theme of reversal speaks to our own lives as well. How many times have we faced circumstances that seemed hopeless, only to see God turn them into sources of unexpected blessing? Perhaps a loss that opened the door to deeper compassion. Perhaps a failure that became the soil for humility and growth. Perhaps a betrayal that pushed us closer to the arms of Christ. The story of Esther reminds us that God specializes in reversals. He is able to write redemption into the darkest chapters. But here is an important truth. Reversals often require participation. Esther had to step into danger. Mordecai had to resist bowing. The Jews had to rise and defend themselves when the day came. God's deliverance is not passive. It often invites us to act. Faith is not idleness. It is obedience. For some of us, courage means speaking up when silence feels safer. For others, it means waiting with patience when rushing would only make things worse. For others still, it means letting go of control and trusting God with outcomes we cannot see. Esther's story holds space for all of these. She trembled, but she acted. She waited, but she also spoke. She surrendered, but she also prepared. Courage is multifaceted, because faith is multifaceted. We should not forget the humanity of Esther. Too often we lift biblical heroes so high that they no longer seem human, no longer seem like us. But Esther was a young woman, likely terrified, likely sleepless on the nights before her decision. She knew the risk. She knew that death was a very real possibility. And yet she said, "If I perish, I perish." That raw surrender was not superhuman. It was deeply human. And because of that, it gives us hope. If Esther, with trembling hands and racing heart, could stand in her calling, then so can we. Think of your own life right now. Where is God whispering, for such a time as this? It may not be in a palace or before a throne, but it may be in your workplace, your family, your community. Perhaps there is someone who needs you to stand up for them. Perhaps there is injustice you are called to confront. Perhaps there is a risk you must take to live faithfully. Courage will not always look dramatic. Sometimes it will look like faithfulness in the ordinary, like love in the face of indifference, like integrity when compromise would be easier. As the story of Esther spreads its roots deeper into our hearts, we also learn that identity matters. Mordecai refused to bow because his allegiance was to God alone. Esther revealed her identity at the right time, aligning herself openly with her people. For us, too, There comes a time when hiding can no longer remain an option. Courage means living fully in who we are as God's people, even when that identity puts us at odds with the culture around us. In the end, the book of Esther does more than recount history. It calls us to examine our own stories, to see the hidden hand of God in the coincidences and reversals of our lives, and to step into the courage that He calls forth from us. We may never wear crowns of gold or face decrees of kings, but each of us has moments when we are asked to stand, to speak, to surrender, to act. And it may be that we, too, were placed in our circumstances for such a time as this. The celebration of Purim, the festival of reversal and remembrance, became a living rhythm for the people of God. Each year, the story would be retold, laughter and joy filling the homes that once had been filled with mourning. Children dressed in costumes of Esther, Mordecai, even Haman, not to glorify evil but to remember that evil can be overthrown. Food was exchanged, gifts given to the poor, tables spread with abundance. The people remembered, and by remembering, they renewed their faith in the God who saves. But beyond the feasting, Purim carried a warning. It reminded them of what might have been had Esther remained silent, had Mordecai compromised, had the people refused to rise. It is easy, once delivered, to imagine that victory was inevitable. But the story whispers otherwise. It required courage. It required faith. It required obedience to step into the place God had prepared. Deliverance came, yes, but through vessels willing to be used. The story of Esther does not mention God by name. His voice does not thunder from the heavens. No prophet stands to declare His word. Yet His fingerprints are everywhere. From the sleepless night of a king to the casting of lots that fell exactly as God willed, the tapestry of providence is woven in silence. This absence of God's name in the text is not oversight, it is invitation. It calls us to look beyond the obvious, to see the hand of God in what others call coincidence, to trust that even when He is silent, He is never absent. We live in a time when God's voice is often hard to hear. The heavens seem quiet. Prayers sometimes feel as though they vanish into empty air. Yet Esther's story teaches us to look again. The coincidences in your life, the job opportunity that came at just the right time, the friend who called when you were on the edge of despair, the moment of delay that saved you from disaster, may not be coincidences at all. They may be the unseen orchestration of a God who still governs every detail. But let us look deeper into Esther herself. Her courage was not loud or dramatic. She did not stand with sword in hand, commanding armies. She did not deliver sermons to multitudes. Her courage was quieter but no less powerful. It was the courage of one who was willing to risk her life in obedience. It was the courage of one who chose timing and wisdom instead of reckless haste. It was the courage of one who carried the weight of her people on trembling shoulders and walked into the throne room knowing she might not walk out again. This teaches us that courage is not always about grand gestures. More often, it is about quiet faithfulness. It is about saying yes when fear urges no. It is about showing up when everything in you wants to hide. It is about speaking truth with gentleness, even when lies would be safer. Courage looks different for each of us, but its essence remains. Obedience to God's call in the face of fear. Mordecai's words echo here with piercing clarity. Who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? These words are not only for Esther, they are for us. Each of us lives within a story larger than ourselves. We may not sit on thrones, but we occupy places of influence, homes, workplaces, friendships, communities. And in each place, God has placed us with purpose. Perhaps you, too, have been positioned for such a time as this. Think of your workplace. Perhaps there is someone isolated, overlooked, carrying burdens they never voice. You may be the Esther in their life, the one who dares to step into their pain with compassion, the one who speaks words of encouragement that shift the course of their story. Or think of your family. Perhaps there is brokenness, silence, wounds unhealed. You may be the Esther who chooses to confront with love, who risks discomfort for the sake of reconciliation. Or think of the larger world, issues of justice, mercy, truth. Perhaps your voice, trembling though it may be, is the one God has called to speak. The story also warns us of Haman's path. Pride, unchecked, leads to destruction. His desire for honor became an idol that devoured him. He demanded that others bow, blind to the fact that the only one worthy of universal honor is God himself. His hatred of Mordecai metastasized into a plan of genocide, revealing the destructive power of bitterness left to grow. Pride isolates. Pride blinds. Pride destroys. In Haman's downfall, we see the ultimate truth that God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. And what of Mordecai? He stands as a figure of steadfast faithfulness. He would not bow to Haman, for his knees bent only to God. He raised Esther as his own daughter, teaching her integrity that would one day save a nation. He wept when the decree of destruction was issued, clothed himself in sackcloth, and prayed. And when he was elevated to a place of honor, he used his authority not for himself, but for the protection and flourishing of his people. Faithfulness in small things prepared him for faithfulness in great things. Is that not how God often works with us? The daily choices of integrity, humility, and prayer prepare us for the larger moments of courage. We long for the dramatic calling, the great destiny, but God often begins with faithfulness in the hidden places. Will we bow to the idols of our age? Will we remain silent in the face of injustice? Will we raise others to walk in faith? These small choices, unseen by the world, shape us into vessels ready for God's greater purposes. Let us not forget the costliness of Esther's courage. She risked her life, her comfort, her position. She stepped into danger, knowing the outcome was uncertain. True courage will always carry cost. It may not cost your life, but it may cost your reputation. It may cost your comfort. It may cost relationships or opportunities. But the call of God has always carried cost. Jesus himself said, "Whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." Esther's willingness to perish echoes this truth. She laid down her life, and in doing so, she found it and saved countless others. As we meditate on this story, we are invited not only to admire Esther, but to imitate her. To ask ourselves, where is God calling me to risk? Where is he calling me to step out of safety and into faith? What fears must I face with trembling courage? Perhaps the answer lies closer than you think. Perhaps it is in the quiet act of forgiveness you have resisted. Perhaps it is in the honest conversation you have delayed. Perhaps it is in the decision to live openly as a follower of Christ in a culture that mocks faith. Wherever it is, the story of Esther whispers, "Do not think you were placed here by accident. You are here for such a time as this." The echoes of Esther's courage lingered long after the immediate danger had passed. In the months and years that followed, the Jewish people lived with a new awareness. Their survival had not been by chance, but by the hidden hand of God working through trembling human vessels. Esther remained queen. Mordecai continued in his position of influence, and the annual festival of Purim ensured that no generation would forget what had happened. Yet the story's relevance stretches far beyond ancient Persia. It speaks to every heart and every age, calling us to recognize the power of faith, the necessity of courage, and the hope of God's unseen providence. Imagine the Jews scattered across the vast empire. From India to Ethiopia, families gathered in their homes when the time of Purim came. Parents told their children of the decree that once promised death and the deliverance that followed instead. They laughed, they feasted, they sent gifts. For a people who had long lived under the shadow of exile, Purim was more than a holiday. It was a declaration. We are not forgotten. Our God sees us. Our God saves us. The retelling of the story kept hope alive in the hearts of a scattered nation. For us, this act of remembrance becomes a model. When God intervenes in our lives, we too are called to remember. Not only in private thanksgiving, but in public testimony. When we tell our stories of deliverance, we strengthen others. When we celebrate God's faithfulness, we proclaim that He is still at work. Too often we treat blessings as ordinary, forgetting them once the next challenge arises. But Esther's story urges us to pause, to establish rhythms of remembrance, to tell our children and our communities, look what God has done. And yet, if we look closely, we see that deliverance did not erase all fear. The Jews still lived in exile. They were still a minority in a vast empire. Esther was still a queen in a palace that was not her home. Mordecai still served a king who was unpredictable and flawed. Victory did not mean perfection. Deliverance did not mean the absence of future trials. It meant that in this crisis, God had been faithful and therefore He could be trusted again. This is crucial for us. Too often we expect that one great act of faith, one great deliverance, will mean the end of all struggles. But life under God's providence does not promise ease. It promises His presence. Courage is not a one-time decision. It is a repeated choice. Just as Esther had to continue living faithfully after her great risk, so we must continue choosing courage in the small and large moments of our lives. Let us consider for a moment the way Esther's story foreshadows Christ. Like Esther, Jesus stepped into danger on behalf of His people. Like Esther, He approached the throne, though His throne was not one of Persia's gold, but the throne of heaven's justice. And unlike Esther, Jesus did not merely risk His life. He gave it. Where Esther said, "If I perish, I perish," Jesus said, "I lay down my life willingly." The courage Esther displayed points us forward to the greater courage of Christ, who endured the cross for the sake of our deliverance. And in Christ's resurrection, we see the ultimate reversal. Just as Haman's gallows became his undoing, so the cross, an instrument of shame and death, became the place of triumph. Death thought it had the final word, but God turned it into the very means of life. The story of Esther is thus a shadow, a whisper of the greater story of redemption fulfilled in Jesus. When we read Esther, we glimpse in advance the heart of the gospel. Deliverance through courage, victory through apparent defeat, life springing from the shadow of death. But there is another dimension to consider. Esther's story challenges us to think about the cost of silence. Mordecai warned her that if she remained silent, deliverance would still come, but she and her father's house would perish. Silence is not neutral. Silence in the face of evil is complicity. Esther had to choose whether to speak up or to protect herself. And in that choice, she revealed that true identity cannot remain hidden forever. This truth presses on us today. There are moments when silence feels safe, when speaking truth could cost us dearly. It might cost us acceptance among friends, advancement in career, or peace in family. Yet silence in such times may not only harm others, it may destroy our own integrity. To remain silent when God calls us to speak is to deny who we are. Esther reminds us that there comes a time when silence is no longer an option. And so the question comes to us: where are we tempted to remain silent? Where are we shrinking back from the courage God calls us to show? Perhaps it is in confronting injustice in society. Perhaps it is in sharing our faith with someone who desperately needs hope. Perhaps it is in setting boundaries in a toxic relationship. Whatever the situation, silence may seem safer, but silence can also be deadly. The story of Esther urges us to step into the risk of speech, trusting that God will use even our trembling words for His purposes. We should not overlook the communal nature of Esther's courage. She did not stand alone. She asked Mordecai to gather all the Jews to fast and pray with her. She drew strength from the faith of her people. In the same way, courage is rarely a solitary act. We need one another. We need the prayers of our brothers and sisters, the encouragement of the faithful, the reminders that we do not stand alone. Courage is contagious, and when one person stands, others find the strength to rise as well. This is why the church matters. This is why community matters. Alone, fear can overwhelm us. But together, we remind each other of God's promises. We intercede for one another. We carry each other's burdens. Esther stood before the king, but behind her stood a people on their knees in fasting and prayer. Our courage, too, must be rooted in community. Finally, Esther's story invites us to trust the mystery of God's providence. The book never mentions His name, yet His presence saturates every page. The sleepless king, the timely reading of Chronicles, the rise and fall of Haman all point to a God who works through what seems ordinary. In our lives, too, we may not see burning bushes or parted seas, but the same God is at work in coincidences, in delays, in open doors and closed ones. Faith is trusting that His silence is not absence, and His hiddenness is not abandonment. Perhaps you are in a season where God feels silent. You pray, but the heavens are quiet. You search for answers, but the path is unclear. Remember Esther. Remember that the absence of God's name did not mean the absence of His hand. Trust that even now, He is weaving a story greater than you can see. As the Jews celebrated Purim year after year, they proclaimed this truth. Even when God's name is hidden, His hand is not. Even when evil rises, it will not have the last word. Even when fear surrounds us, courage can rise. And even when silence seems deafening, God is still present, still faithful, still at work. The story of Esther closes not with despair but with joy, not with death but with life, not with defeat but with victory. Yet its purpose is not simply to give us a happy ending. It calls us to see the world differently, to recognize that faith and courage are woven into the very fabric of God's plan for humanity, and to realize that our own lives are caught up in this same tapestry. Think again of Esther, an orphan girl raised in exile, hidden among a conquered people. Nothing in her beginnings suggested greatness. She had no throne in her future, no crown in her imagination, and yet she was chosen. Her beauty caught the king's eye, but it was her character that caught God's. Beneath her fear lay a faith that could not be extinguished. Beneath her trembling lay a willingness to obey, even if it cost her life. Through her, God preserved his people and ensured that his promises would endure. This is the paradox of God's work. He delights in using the ordinary to accomplish the extraordinary. A shepherd boy becomes a king. A fisherman becomes an apostle. An orphaned exile becomes a queen and a deliverer. And today, he continues to use ordinary men and women, you and me, to carry out his purposes in the world. You may feel small, unseen, unworthy, unprepared. But Esther's story declares that it is not about your strength. It is about God's faithfulness. When Mordecai told Esther that deliverance would come from somewhere else if she remained silent, he spoke a profound truth. God's purposes are never thwarted. He is not dependent on us. Yet in his grace, he invites us to participate. He positions us in places of influence, whether great or small, and calls us to step into courage. To say yes is to join in his story. To say no is to miss the privilege of being part of his redeeming work. So what does this mean for us today? It means we must live with eyes open to the possibility that we, too, are placed for such a time as this. The world is full of brokenness, injustice, and suffering. Fear stalks the hearts of many. Yet in every generation, God raises up Esthers, people who will not bow to fear, who will not remain silent, who will trust that even small acts of obedience can ripple across history. For some, this calling may look dramatic, standing before leaders, challenging systems of injustice, risking life and freedom for truth. For others, it may look ordinary, raising children in faith, speaking kindness in a workplace of bitterness, living with integrity when compromise is easier. Courage does not have one shape. It takes many forms, each precious in God's sight. The important thing is not the scale but the faithfulness. We also learn from Esther that courage is not the absence of fear but the decision to act despite it. She was afraid. She fasted. She asked others to fast with her. She did not walk into the throne room with a fearless grin. She walked with trembling, with prayer, with surrender. Courage is not bravado. Courage is dependence. It is leaning on God's strength when our own is insufficient. It is confessing, I cannot, but he can. In this way, Esther points us forward to Jesus, who in Gethsemane prayed with anguish, sweating drops of blood, asking if the cup might pass from him. Yet he too surrendered. Not my will, but yours be done. His courage carried him to the cross, where fear and death themselves were defeated. Esther risked her life to save her people. Jesus gave his life to save the world. Esther's victory was partial and temporal. Jesus' victory is complete and eternal. And so we are left with a choice. Will we live as people of fear or as people of faith? Will we hide our identity, or will we reveal who we are as God's children? Will we remain silent when injustice rises, or will we speak with trembling courage? Will we bow to the idols of our age, or will we stand as Mordecai stood, knees bent only to the Lord? The book of Esther does not end with the spotlight on Esther alone. Mordecai's faithfulness is honored, the people's deliverance is celebrated, and the community is called to remember. This reminds us that courage is communal as well as personal. Esther stood, but she did not stand alone. Behind her were prayers, fasting, solidarity. Likewise, we need one another. The courage of one can ignite the courage of many. The faith of one can strengthen the faith of others. Perhaps that is why Purim is marked by joy and generosity. Gifts are given to the poor, food shared with neighbors, laughter fills the air. Deliverance is not hoarded, it is celebrated communally. When God saves, it is not for one but for all. In our own lives, when God delivers us, we too are called to share that joy, to give generously, to celebrate together. Salvation is not a private treasure but a communal song. As we bring this story to a close, let us hold its lessons tightly. Courage will cost us something, but cowardice will cost us far more. God's silence does not mean absence. His hiddenness does not mean abandonment. Reversals are possible, even when the decree of death seems sealed. Pride destroys, but humility saves. Memory matters. To forget is to weaken faith, but to remember is to strengthen hope. And above all, our lives are not accidents. We are placed where we are with purpose. Perhaps, indeed, we are here for such a time as this. And so the question remains, what will you do with your time? When the moment comes to stand, will you bow or will you rise? When the choice comes to speak, will you remain silent or will you open your mouth in faith? When fear whispers, will you let it paralyze you? Or will you step forward in trembling courage, trusting that God's unseen hand goes with you? Esther's story has been told for centuries, but its invitation is fresh each time it is heard. You are not Esther, and yet in your own way, you are. You are not in Persia, but you are in your own kingdom, your own family, your own circle of influence. And the God who worked in silence then is still working now. The God who reversed decrees of death then has still reversed them now through Christ. The God who called Esther is calling you. Do not underestimate your place. Do not despise your smallness. Do not imagine that courage belongs only to others. For who knows whether you have not come to this place, this season, this moment, for such a time as this?